Cast your mind back to the 1980s. Remember the UDF? The slogan went, UDF unites, apartheid divides. The United Democratic Front was one of the most important anti-apartheid organizations of the 1980s and brought huge internal pressure to the ultimate ungovernability of the apartheid regime. One of the key drivers of that movement, Naidoo, joins me to talk about what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in South Africa. But let's start with Brazil, the impeachment motion against somebody he has met, somebody he knows, Dilma Rousseff, and one of her predecessors, of course, the famous Lula da Silva. Also, the role of civil society groups in democracies. It's a broad-ranging conversation, but let's start in Brazil. You know Dilma Rousseff, you've met her.
Yeah, I've met her. But
you're buddies with Lula da Silva.
Yes, you know, the trade union movement, COSATU, started to build a relationship with CUT, which is our equivalent in Brazil, in the early 90s. And, you know, Lula came out of the Brazilian Metal Workers Union. So we were introduced to him early on when he wasn't the president, when he was just set up the party, the Workers' Party, which is a broad coalition of many groups, from intelligentsia to peasant movements to landless, you know, peasant movements to, you know, civic movements, like a UDF. And it was very interesting because the core value is about what is democracy, you know, based on social justice and the restoration of human dignity. So we started building South-to-South cooperation long before the idea of BRICS became a reality. And so for him, we've maintained a relationship over many years.
And this is a guy who then helped transform Brazil, transformed the Brazilian economy, created state-owned enterprises, which for a while were some of the most impressive in the world, with Embraer and with Vale, the iron ore producer, and others. And Brazil was flying high for a period of time. I was talking to the man from Gibbs just recently, to Lyle White, who's an expert on the BRICS region, of course, and in emerging economies, and he was saying Lula just didn't go far enough. He didn't take the transformation of the economy far enough, and we've seen the insert of corruption, and we've seen the failure in many cases of these institutions. What's your take on it?
Well, I think one of of course, it's a magnificent example of what a strong president that is ethical and moral can do to transform an economy, because 15 million jobs are created. You know, every Brazilian poor family receives a grant today, the Bolsa Familiar, that's helped raise people out of poverty. So there's been tremendous gains. However, the system in Brazil was corrupt in the past, and it didn't do anything to change that electoral system where everyone takes money. All of the parties take money to fund the campaigns, at least with the Workers' Party. You know, what we had was senior people implicated in that corruption where they took money, you know, but there's no evidence that I have that either Lula or Dilma Rousseff took money personally, misused public funds.
Because now your friend Lula is facing corruption allegations.
Yes.
Dilma Rousseff is facing impeachment in Brazil, and it's like somebody let the dogs out, and they've smelt blood in Brazilian waters.
Yeah, and absolutely, you know, part of this thing is a challenge that a lot of the role the Workers' Party played was addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and marginalized. And of course, there's a competitiveness between the middle classes and the ruling classes, and the fact that the state has been primarily directing its efforts at the poor. I think the second thing is that the institutions, and this is where if a political system or an economic system is corrupt inherently, that corruption begins to infect even those that are good that go into that system. Very similar to what's happened to here. And the public institutions start to fail. The connection between the party which came to the power on the back of a deep connection with the people becomes alienated from the people. And then the purpose of the political party becomes staying in power rather than serving the interests of the society.
Now, Brazilian institutions, I mean, my knowledge of Brazil comes down to boxes of chocolates with nuts in them. Let's be blunt about it. But are Brazilian institutions holding up? It doesn't seem, from what you're saying, that they are.
Well, I think some of the institutions are under severe stress, you know, particularly the state-owned institutions. Petrobras, for example, has been implicated in very high levels of corruption at a senior level. And I think it's important that where there are public institutions, where there are allegations of corruption, that they get investigated and people get prosecuted.
But if the system is as corrupt as you suggest, and so we prosecute Lula and we prosecute Dilma Rousseff, and then Dilma Rousseff's own deputy, who's from an opposition party, is aching to get into the hot seat in Brazil, he's going to face some impeachment charges of his own, and simply we go from crisis to crisis to crisis in a country like that with a structure like that.
Yes, exactly. And that is the crisis of constitutionalism in Brazil, which is also a bit of a crisis of constitutionalism here in South Africa, because at the end of the day, government's role to implement programs and policies that have been passed that meet the needs of people is impeded, and people stop making decisions. So I think that, yes, there is a constitutional crisis in Brazil, but there's also a political crisis, because there's a political crisis between two very different trajectories of growth and development. And you're seeing a resurgence of what I will call the ruling elites that say, well, we've had enough of paying attention to ordinary people now. We've got to grow the economy, and even talk of almost returning back to a military dictatorship.
Which is terrifying. We look at Latin America and we look at the history of the last 100 years with military dictatorships across that continent, which the great hope of the 70s, 80s and 90s in Latin America was that democracy was going to pay the dividend that was going to be good for everybody.
Exactly. So I think that what Brazil really needs, and it's a very dangerous period because the debates are extremely polarized, it needs someone who can bridge those differences. You know, it needs another Lula, basically, to say, Lula did it. He represented ordinary people. He had a leftist point of view. He had a progressive point of view. Although he never called himself a socialist or a communist, he came out of the working class. But he built strong bridges, even with the private sector, and tried to construct a Brazil that was socially and economically inclusive.
Let's look at that where we are right now in South Africa, and we look at the state institutions, which many people were thought had been, to use the term, captured. And the Constitutional Court drew a line in the sand earlier this year and said, this far and no further. We've suddenly seen, to coin a Tony Leon phrase, a fight back by the institutions to claim back land they were perceived to have lost.
Yes, and I think that's a very, very important point, because ultimately institutions are as good as the people that run them. And if you really ask me, one of our errors in drawing up the Constitution is that we left the power of appointment in the hands of an executive. And so institutions which are really potentially there to protect our rights can be very easily undermined by this placing a person in the position of authority who does not serve the Constitution but serves the political interest of political individuals that are in the leadership or a political party. I think that is our danger.
Are you not being a bit hard on the Constitution? I know you were instrumental in the negotiations of the Constitution. If anybody can criticize it, you can criticize it. But there is the fail-safe, and that fail-safe is the Constitutional Court, which has said, okay, you have that power, but actually you don't have absolute power as a president of a constitutional democracy.
Bruce, I completely agree with it. I applaud the Constitutional Court. I think they were courageous. They did the job that we appointed to them to.
But it's remember, fine and narrow line.
But remember, there is a political process that appoints these judges. Who knows what is going to come after this outstanding court that we have? And that's the point I'm making. You know, at the end of the day, the most important check and balance and the countervailing force on a political system and political parties in particular is an active citizenry, a citizenry that is aware of its rights, that is mobilized, like in the time that the struggle for our freedom, that people were prepared to stand up and say, this is wrong.
What is the difference, so the fundamental difference? Why is it that we as South Africans in our various comfort zones and various zones of crisis, we don't have a sense of urgency, as you so rightly point out we had in the 1980s, in the death knell of apartheid? There was this surge of activism that really, from an internal perspective, put huge pressure on the South African government. Nowadays, we look at it and we've got issues that affect the long-term sustainability of South Africa, yet we're happy to leave it to somebody else to sort out.
Yes,
we'll leave it to Section 27. We'll leave it to Naidoo, who, when he's not farming in the Free State, can come out and shout his mouth off. But other than the Fees Must Fall movement, which is in itself falling in tatters, we don't really see that civil activism.
No, I think we're at a point of inflection. I think another mistake that we made is assuming that the whole struggle for freedom was to get into power, political power, and sit in the union buildings. When in fact, that was the beginning. It was your first baby step. It actually was, our job was to change the system, the way it related to citizens. And so what I think a challenge that we face in Brazil or here or India is capture of the state.
By any interest.
By any interest, you know, and particularly by predatory interests who have money, so that the inflow of people into government doesn't become serving the citizens, becomes a business opportunity for these interests. I think that's our biggest danger of why democracy is not working today. At the same time, if you look at civil society, broadly defined, from the Section 27 to COSATU to the unions to all of civil society, intelligentsia, the media, if you really look at them, they're also bureaucracies. They're also alienated from the base. So the people today are feeling so angry that things are not being delivered to them. And they feel so alienated from their leaders across the board that the only way they feel they can get action on their needs is to have a demonstration. We are the demonstration and protest capital of the world. But
it's a sign of hopelessness.
No, it's a sign of hopelessness. Now, in the past, that anger would have been galvanized, organized, and directed into a movement that negotiated with those that were using arbitrary decisions to deny us our rights.
Are we headed that way?
I don't think we are there yet, because the way in which we are looking at the rise of movements, and that's why I'm hopeful, even if the fees must fall or the roads must fall, does not succeed in its first instance. Remember, we started organizing trade unions in the mid-70s. It took us to 1985, 10 years for it to become a COSATU. I am confident and optimistic that this new starting of disenchantment, of anger, of going into the streets will lead to something positive, but it needs to be organized. Otherwise, what happens? It ends up in violence, and violence then becomes a language. That is the danger.
There's a far simpler solution, and that is just getting a government to do its job.
Exactly, but you know, as we know, with governments anywhere in the world, you know, Joe Slovo said to me, I remember in 1994, a few months after we had gone into government, we were going into a meeting in Langa or Guguleto, and the people they were basically heckling us. And we had this discussion after in the car going back. How do we interpret this? And we both felt it was a good idea. If people are banging on our doors, it'll keep us on our toes. Today, people think I have the arrogance of being elected a leader. I've been given a mandate, therefore I do not need to consult. That's what we got to end today. And that's why today we have to return to the value system, to the moral compass that guided us. That our job in government is not to serve ourselves as a business opportunity or to serve our family's interests. It is to serve the interests of citizens. And if we could get that within business, within trade unions, within NGOs, within our universities, within our media, and especially within our government, we would be a brilliantly successful country.
Naidoo, we must leave it there, unfortunately. Your name dropping, by the way, is very good. As I was saying to Joe Slovo, as Joe Slovo said to me, the only one who beats that is Richard Branson, who once said to me, when I introduced Nelson Mandela to the Dalai Lama,
yes.
I mean, that's name dropping. If you can include Nelson
please
Mandela and the Dalai Lama.
don't ever compare me to Richard Branson.
Got the beard. He's got the beard. Naidoo, thank you so much for joining us. He doesn't have titles anymore other than farmer from the Free State and facilitator of big discussions and thinker of deep issues, social economic issues, talking about the future, of course. More money makers and those that will secure the future for money makers next time on The Money Makers. Till then, bye-bye.